We're going to talk about federalism, which is often seen as one of the more boring parts of government, but it's actually really important because it affects who you in your life deal with. Are you going to be dealing with state rules or national government, meaning federal rules? So let's get a bead on how things have changed historically in the power struggle between the national government and the states. All right, so let's start with a definition. Federalism is a system of government instituted by our Constitution, obviously, whereby various powers are divided between levels of government. By levels, I mean the national government and the states. Now, when people use the term federal government, they mean the national government. So I'll be saying federal government throughout this course and mean the national government. And that's also when you're having discussions among friends, that's the term that's commonly used. All right, so here's a comparison. In the middle, you'll see federal government. That's us. The national government is above the states. It can give rules to the states. That's that direct arrow. But you see the other arrow that goes all the way around to the people of the state. The national government can affect the people living in a state directly. Now, let's oppose that to a unitary system where the national government acts directly on the people. If there are any regional or quote unquote state governments at all they do is administer the national government rules. Now, a confederation is a bit of an odd thing. That's where the states are in charge. They control the central government. All the central government does is coordinate activity between the states, and the states rule their own people. So a confederation, obviously the South during the Civil War. More recently, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, the Confederation of Independent States. It's still kind of operating now, but Russia's taken back a lot of control. Federal government, us, and Canada, right? Canadian provinces kind of operate like our states. Now, unitary government, China, right, and a sort of a dictatorship, but also France, which is a democracy. Those are both unitary systems. So unitary doesn't necessarily mean autocratic. All right, now, here's the basic question for federalism. It's which level of government, national or the state, which level should have the authority, the power to decide which fundamental issues? Well, can the Constitution decide? Well, some people say it can decide everything, but it's actually a piece of paper that needs to be interpreted. So it's not quite that clear cut. Now, our Supreme Court, that's who interprets the Constitution, right? We talked about that when we talked about the Constitution. It's interpreted this question differently at different times, and we're going to look at that as we sort out what federalism means in America. So two camps emerged, right, to answer that core question, who should have more authority? There's the nation-centered camp, the national government should have more authority, and the state-centered camp, state should have more authority. Let's take a look at these nation-centered interpretations first. So some of these are going to be Supreme Court cases. Others, will be just sort of examples. But we're just going to look at things that epitomize each of the arguments. So the first is a Supreme Court case. It's McCulloch v. Maryland. So here's the thing. The national government says we need a national bank to do our stuff. We need to put a branch in Baltimore. Well, the bankers in Maryland said, oh, no, you don't. We can't stand this. So we're going to levy a tax on this bank. And so they take it in and give it to the bursar, the person who's going to, would pay bills for the bank, and say, here's your bill. And Mr. McCulloch says, yeah, I don't think so. So there's a suit, obviously, and it goes before the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says, okay, it affirmed the supremacy clause. The national government is supreme to the state governments. The state can't tax the national government. It can't make rules over the national government. So that's affirming the supremacy clause. But next, it expanded what are called the implied powers. Now, there are explicit powers. Those are the ones that are listed. Anything that's listed or numbered is called enumerated powers, and they are stated explicitly in the Constitution. But implied powers are ones that are implied by the government, right, or implied by the text of the Constitution. So Article 1, Section 8 in the Constitution, you've read this. It has this long list of things that the Congress, the national government, is allowed to do. Create post roads for a post office, set weights and measures, which is why we don't have the metric system, right? The national government says no. But also to pay bills, incur debts, coin money. Nowhere in that list does it say the national government can make a bank. But having a bank is implied by other things on the list: to pay debts, right? To borrow money. So if you were going to hire me to paint your house, you didn't say I could go buy paint, but it's implied that I go buy paint in order to paint your house, right? It is necessary and proper for me to purchase paint. Or another example might be to power wash your house first. It is necessary and proper for me to power wash the house before I actually paint it, which was in our little contract there. So that's the necessary and proper clause, right? That government can do things that are necessary and proper as long as it relates to something on an official list, an explicit power. It's also called the elastic clause because it allows the power of government to stretch, and we're going to see that's going to be controversial as we go along. Next is another Supreme Court case, Gibbons v. Ogden. 1824. This was interesting. The steamships were coming into more frequent use. The state of New York issued licenses to give exclusive rights to one group to be able to operate steamships from the New Jersey shore side to the New York City side. Well, there was a lawsuit said, hey, New York, you can't do that. It's, messing over our business people here in New Jersey. And it goes before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court actually says, you know what? New York, you cannot do that. The national government is over interstate commerce. That's between different governments, not intra-state, which is within, but interstate commerce, between different states. This would have really important, long-lasting ramifications, right? So if the federal government can make rules relating to interstate commerce, then if your business is involved in interstate commerce, and hint, they all are, even restaurants don't make their own forks, for example, then the federal government can make rules that apply to you. Oh, I don't know, rules like, hey, you can't refuse to serve African Americans. So this 1824 case is actually going to be really important when we get to the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement. All right, the next nation-centered interpretation are the New Deal social and economics reforms. These happened in the 30s, and they were after we fell into the Great Depression. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit. The national government wanted to pull the country out of the Great Depression, so it intervened very heavily. It expanded the national government greatly to address these things. All right, we'll come back to that. State-centered interpretations. First, the nullification crisis. As with most national crises in the 1800s, South Carolina was right there in the middle of it. South Carolina didn't like the Tariff Acts of 1828 and 1832. Our cotton-based economy, we did not want tariffs. The whole world was buying our cotton, and tariffs would just cause people to retaliate, whereas the North wanted tariffs to protect their industries, which were weaker than our cotton industry. So the South said, oh, no. You know what? I don't care if you pass that or not. We're going to nullify it within our borders. It just won't apply here. Congress said, yeah, I don't think so. So they passed what was known as the Force Bill. Force Bill said Andrew Jackson could use the military against South Carolina. The Civil War almost started right here in 1832 instead of a decade or so later. Now, here's what happened, though. At the same time, Congress also passed the Compromise Tariff of 1833, and it gave in to South Carolina. So the national government backed away. That's why this is a state-centered kind of interpretation. Next, Scott v. Sanford. This is the Dred Scott case you may have heard about in history classes. First, it declared slaves their property. They're not citizens. More frighteningly, it said even free blacks couldn't be U.S. citizens. For example, it said, hey, U.S. citizens can travel to any state they want. They can carry guns. We can't have black people being able to travel where they want, carry guns, say what they want. Oh, no, so let's not allow them to be citizens. But it also importantly overturned the Missouri Compromise, important for today. So the Missouri Compromise had brought Maine in as a free state and Missouri in as a slave state to keep the balance between the North and the South, slave and free states. It also agreed to prohibit all slavery north of 3630 parallel, except for Missouri. So what happened was when Scott v. Sanford came along and said, hey, national government, you can't do that. Basically, you're saying all states that might come into this union above that line will have to be free. Well, you don't have that right. The states get to decide for themselves. This was also the second use of judicial review, by the way. Last state-centered interpretation, Civil War. The state said, you know what, we've had enough. We're leaving the Union. So that was the ultimate state-centered interpretation. We get to leave the Union. It turns out, no, you can't leave the Union. So it was their ultimate defeat as well. Now, we're going to talk about models of federalism. These are not hard and fast, right? These are ways we look back at federalism and say, let's explain how government worked. It wasn't that somebody flipped a switch and said, now we're officially changing from dual to cooperative. Not how it works, right? So we're just using these terms over rough periods of time to try and explain how the government worked. Dual federalism, roughly 1800 to 1937. In another lecture, I'll explain why we picked the 1937 date. Dual federalism clearly divided powers between the national and state governments, right? There is a layer between the two, completely separating them. There is the top layer, national government. It is on top, and the lower level of states, and those things do not mix, like a layer cake, right? There's the top layer, there's the bottom layer, they do not mix. So the national government was on top, which was debatable for some folks. The power of the national government did not encroach into the state layer. The states ruled their people as they saw fit. This was called the layer cake model of federalism. Fall of dual federalism mainly came about because big businesses and corporations, they advocated for laissez-faire, hands-off economics, right? The government shouldn't interfere. That's based on Adam Smith. Adam Smith said that the invisible hand of the market should determine prices and production and those things. But this is not what Smith himself had advocated. He actually said, okay, there is a role for government, right? Obviously, on the basketball court, the officials don't reach out and trip one team so that one side will win, but they do prevent the sides from cheating, so that it's fair and the best team wins, right? So Adam Smith actually said there's a role for government to make sure things are fair. Well, big businesses didn't want to hear any of this. Big business, they created monopolies, which is quite literally the opposite of capitalism. They exploited workers with low wages and long hours, right? In fact, there was a push by laborers to say, hey, how about only working 6 days a week and only 10 hours a day? And they were crushed, right? Not allowed to do that. Here's an example, child labor. Congress in 1916 passed an anti-child labor law, but the corporation sued, and the Supreme Court sided with them, right? So the Supreme Court struck down anti-child labor law, so it allowed child labor in the Supreme Court case. You see the Hammer-Degenhardt. So here's the thing. They were using an economic interpretation of the 14th Amendment. 14th Amendment was meant to give the freed slaves after the Civil War citizenship. Right, all persons born or naturalized in the United States, citizens of the United States. Here's the line: no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So if Congress is interpreting a person as a corporation, right, all of a sudden that reads, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of corporations, businesses of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any corporation or business of life, liberty, and property without due process of law. Telling a corporation you can't employ children was infringing on its freedom. Yes, that's how it was interpreted. Anyway, fall of cooperative federalism. FDR and the New Deal. So the Great Depression was just destroyed, put millions and millions of people out of work. They were literally starving to death. The states were broke. They couldn't help the people in their states. The national government had money, but no way to get people the money. All right. So, for example, the bank has money. It's not in your hands, though. There has to be a mechanism to get it in your hands. That mechanism is either a credit card or the car loan process. That's the mechanism, right? So they had to create government programs, right? Mechanisms that would get money to the people. And some of these programs would be administered by the states using national government money, and others directly by national government. This is based on Keynesianism, right? So Keynesianism is an economic philosophy that says, okay, if the economy is going terrible, One thing we can do is to try and get the economy flowing again, like a water pump. Right now, the old water pumps, imagine one sticking out of the ground with a big handle on it. You might have seen it in old Western movies or something. So, the way to get this rusted shut pump, if you want to pump water out of it, the way to get it going is to take water and pour it down it to loosen it up. That's called priming the pump. So to get water, you have to first pour some water down it. Well, that was the argument of Keynesianism, that it's okay for a government to go into debt to borrow money, because it's going to then put that money back in the economy through these programs and, putting people to work, for example. So the Works Progress Administration, later renamed the Work Projects Administration, they're both called the WPA. The WPA put people to work. And if I went to work on a WPA project, I had money in my pocket. And with that money in my pocket, I bought goods. And the company that made those goods had to make more of them. And to make more of them, they had to hire more people. To hire more people, they had to pay them. And those people had money in their pockets. And they bought things. And those goods, they had to be made more of. And so, it'll kickstart the economy. But to do that, those first people had to get money in their pockets. And so the WPA paid writers to write. It paid artists to paint. It built roads into the wilderness. It would go to tiny little women's colleges in the South and build giant 5,000 seat auditoriums where, the goal's not because that college needed Burns Auditorium here on Winthrop's campus, but that people would have to be put to work to do it, right? So that's the idea behind Keynesianism. However, the philosophy of Keynesianism also demands, hey, once the economy is going again, let's scale back. We have to quit spending money so we can pay off this debt. So we have to scale back these programs. Now, we'll see that we didn't do that. Other things that started up during this time are kind of social programs, like what we know as Social Security now. Started under this. Before you quit working, you quit getting money. And you started getting money at 65. Now it's moved up to 67. It'll be 70 soon. Here's the thing, though. The average age where people died was before 65. So this was really meant for only very old age care, as opposed to today where people are living into their 80s. So Social Security was created then. Also, unemployment, those are called transfer benefits. Unemployment, social programs such as that were created in this time as well. As opposed to our layer cake, cooperative federalism is called the marble cake model, as the colors are mixed in the marble cake, so the functions are mixed in the American federal system, right? You see all the colors swirled there. This one might be better because, yes, they're swirled, but you do see that color, the more vanilla flavor, I guess, is more on top, like the federal government would be on top. So the fall of cooperative federalism. Well, they forgot that last part of Keynesianism, that you're supposed to actually shrink government back when programs are no longer needed. To be fair, they tried, but the people that were helped by those programs screamed, no, we'll vote you out of office. Said, okay, fine, we'll cut this other program. The people helped by that program said, no, we'll cut you out of office. So there was some voices say don't forget to cut, but every time they tried to cut, the squeaky wheel got the grease and it never got cut. Government got too big. So we finally come into new federalism. The idea of new federalism is to allow the states to have more of a say in how they run their affairs, right? So here's an example, the difference between categorical grants, which were favored under cooperative federalism, and block grants, which were favored under new federalism. So let's say that I'm going to give you money to solve your problem with transportation. You have a problem in transportation. I'm going to help you solve that problem by giving you money for transportation. If I were giving you a categorical grant, I would say you have to use this $5,500 to buy a used Honda, and you must buy a used Honda Accord that is $5,500 or less, and that's the way you're going to solve it. So a categorical grant gives you the money, but it tells you how you have to spend it. Block grant is saying, okay, you have to use this money for transportation, but you you're the state here. You get to solve your transportation problem as you see fit. Maybe you want to fly home to visit family several times, so use your transportation money to buy plane tickets to visit your family. It's still transportation. Or you might live in a city, so you buy bus passes or subway passes. Some of you might buy a car. Some of you might buy a motor scooter and some plane or train tickets, right? But it all has to be spent on transportation, but you get to decide what's more appropriate. So that's what I mean by allowing states more of a say. Currently, we are still more or less in cooperative federalism, or I'm sorry, in new federalism. The pendulum, depending on the president, swings sometimes more to strong national government or strong state governments. Like under Reagan, it was much stronger state governments. Under Carter, it was more stronger national governments. Clinton, it actually depended. With economic issues under Bush, it was stronger state issues, but and security issues, stronger national government. So the pendulum's swinging now, and that's really where we sit today with regard to federal power.